From my side, my name is Himanshu Shekhar. I work for the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, and it's a pleasure to welcome every one of you. We are based in Bonn, in Germany, and it's an afternoon time for us. And I hope wherever you are joining us from North America, from Latin America, so good morning to you, from people in the eastern part of Asia, nice evening, and people in Africa, thanks a lot for joining. So everyone, we really excited to start with the first event of the Academy series. So just a small background of what we do and why do we do. So the Academy program, People's Pathway to Climate Action, is being organized by the United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security, along with Munich Re Foundation, and in collaboration with the UN Climate Change Secretariat, UNFCCC. We are very happy to have the legacy of this program now running for more than 12 years, and we are excited to have a very esteemed panel with us today. We have the Vice Chairman of the Foundation, Dirk Reinhardt. We have Dr. Simone Sandoz from UNUHS, Dr. Zita Sabesbury from UNUHS. We have Dr. Coco Warner from UNFCCC and Dr. Eberhard Faust, who is an ex-chief scientist of Munich Re. Over the course of next 8 webinars during the course of this week, we are going to deal with different aspects of nature-based solution, its application. But today we want to start with the larger picture. Why what we do, why it matters. You know, this is the decade of action. The recent IPCC report clearly states it's the core dread for humanity. We need to have transformative action, and the very nature of nature-based solution, simply by allowing participation at the ground level in a very sustainable way, could go a long way in bringing this transformative change that we very much need. And definitely just 2 months from now, or maybe less than 2 months, we would be starting COP26 from UNFCCC would be taking place. So Coco, definitely something we will also keep in mind during our discussions. So the idea is to understand how nature-based solution would allow us to look at the climate extremes. And Eberhard, we could not have been happier to have a, you have on the board, you would be tackling with this. We would then be going to Zita to bring in the larger perspective on nature-based solution. We would come to Simone. Simone, you are a specialist in the urban planning field, and you would be bringing the urban dimension. And Coco, we would be coming to you to understand the policy dimension. You have a strong experience with climate negotiations, with climate change policy making at the UNFCCC. So why and how all this matters in climate policy making? How would it help? So that's in general the plan. But before we start, a bit of housekeeping. So you would see there is question and answer tab, and please, if possible, add your questions to Q&A tab only, so that we are able to, just give me a second. Yeah, so that we are able to keep a tab of all the questions that are coming our way. You can also use the chat to introduce yourself, but if possible, please put your questions in Q&A only. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording would be made available publicly afterwards on UNU channels. This webinar is also being live streamed on UNU EHS social media channels. So yes, with this and without any further delay, first and foremost, I would like to welcome Dirk Reinhardt, who is the Vice Chairman of the Foundation and who has been with the Foundation since 2004, if I'm not right, Dirk. Dirk, the floor is yours, and we very much look forward to the kind words from the Foundation.
Thank you very much, Himanshu. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are. Ladies and gentlemen, dear project partners, dear co-speakers, dear participants of the 2021 Climate Academy, I have the pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Munich Re Foundation, and also a very warm welcome to Dr. Zita Sabesbury, Dr. Simone Sandoz, Dr. Coco Warner, and Dr. Eberhard Faust. Now, all protocols observed. Again, a warm welcome you to the Academy 2021. This Academy is part of a series of summer academies that we have been organizing with the United Nations University in Bonn and in collaboration with the Climate Secretariat for over 15 years now. We are convinced that the Academy, and especially its participants, can make an important contribution to climate protection and adaptation. The Munich Re Foundation is a non-for-profit organization working in the fields of water, climate change, poverty reduction, and disaster risk reduction. We were founded in 2005 by the reinsurer Munich Re. And what is clear is that the topics that we work in that are key for our work, for our projects, those topics are closely linked to each other. At the academies, we look at the linkages from a scientific perspective and try to work out proposals for solutions. These should find their way into the political discourse at local, but also at international level. For this reason, we work together with the offices of the United Nations. Heat waves, droughts, floods, storms, and cyclones are becoming more severe and more frequent. Since the 80s, the number of such disastrous events has more than doubled worldwide, from around 600 disasters per year to from 300 disasters per year to more than 600, according to data from our funder Munich Re. Climate change is the main driver here, but also factors such as urbanization, demographic changes, and population growth increase the number of people affected by natural hazards. And just a few weeks ago, people in Central Europe were hit by extreme floods, and these events were caused by heavy rainfalls, which affected over 40,000 people. Over 180 lives were lost, over 800 people were injured, and thousands have damaged or no home to live in. This event was truly another wake-up call that being prepared, understanding and reducing the risks, getting the right warnings, and knowing what to do is key. And certainly climate change cannot be ignored, and we need to act now. But if in rather rich countries, extreme weather events can have such a devastating impact, what happens to billions of those who are severely affected by extreme events, but do have much fewer resources to protect themselves efficiently? Solutions must be found here that are efficient and cost-effective, and ideally can rapidly be implemented. Nature-based solutions for climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction can play an important role here, especially in urban areas where most people are exposed to risk from climate change. Smart ecosystem-based solutions can always be found. What needs to be done is to analyze the right technologies and educate people how to use and implement them. We believe that nature-based solutions, in combining with educating people and offering them new income resources, are valuable contributions for successful disaster risk reduction projects. They come with many synergies, such as creating jobs, environmental protection, more livable and safer housing environments, while at the same time often being less expensive than highly complex technical approaches. When one thinks of nature-based solutions, a few options immediately come to mind. Reef protects coastline and people living nearby. Around 19% of the energy from storm and tidal waves can be absorbed by reefs. And I must say, I was scuba diving last week and I saw reefs, and I saw how bad reefs look like at the moment in many places. So one thing is we need to stop destroying nature-based solutions. We need to understand how nature-based solutions function. And then we need to use those mechanisms to adapt and to use in different regions to protect people and the nature and our livelihoods. Now, another example are mangroves that have the capacity to significantly reduce the impact of flood waves. Trees and forests, which with their widely rooted trees, literally hold the soil and water in place. They protect against erosion, avalanches, and landslides, and provide shade when it's hot. And all three provide a habitat for numerous species and play an important role in the carbon cycle. They can therefore improve disaster prevention, protect biodiversity, and protect climate at the same time. And besides these very obvious nature-based solutions that I just mentioned, there are many other smaller or bigger approaches. Now, during this week, we will hear from experts what are the barriers to implement nature-based solutions, and we will discuss solutions, how to overcome them. We will also learn what ideas and concepts you, as the participants of the Academy, may have already worked with, developed, or even implemented. Successful case studies are important to get nature-based solutions on the political agenda and to scale efforts. Now, the Climate Academy aims to achieve 3 goals. We want to provide a platform for exchange. The exchange could take place between actors from science, politics, and practice. The second is the discussions and analysis during the Academy. They should help to better address hurdles. We also aim at publishing the results and advise policymakers and practitioners. And finally, we hope that the participants of the Academy will network, exchange, and discover synergies that help to boost their own work. And maybe more ideas develop later based on the networks and friendships developed during this Climate Academy. Unfortunately, the networking part can be difficult in such a virtual online setting, especially this year. Therefore, we explicitly invite you all to make use of the interactive sessions, to use the time slots for questions and answers, and above all, to talk to us and the other participants bilaterally. As a representative of the Munich Re Foundation, I wish our partners from UNU and UNFCCC successful Climate Academy. And I would like to thank all of you for your hard work, the entire team in preparing the Academy, and especially big thank you goes to Himanshu and Christian, who are the project managers behind this. And I wish all participants and speakers an informative and interactive week. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dirk. Thanks a lot for your warm words. Definitely this, I always find, it has been an absolute pleasure working with the program for last 4 years almost now. And this constellation of, private sectors, actors, the foundation, the civil society actors, UN organizations, and emerging change makers. I guess this rightly provides the mix that we need to bring these accents on the ground across different scales. So thanks a lot for pointing out to different types of interactions we can have, the challenges at hand, and to put further light on this, to understand the larger context. We are very pleased to invite Dr. Eberhard Faust. Eberhard Faust, he was the chief scientist at Munich Re until October last year, and he has a strong background in hazard and associated risk estimation. He has been a lead author for IPCC 5th assessment report, and he holds a master's in environmental science from University of Beirut and PhD in Protestant theology from University of Heidelberg. So with this, Dr. Faust, the floor is yours. I hope you should be able to share your screen now as well, if you like.
Yeah, I will do so. Thank you very much, Himanshu. Okay. Now we switch to the screen. Hope you can see my first slide. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, for having me here. And I'm very happy that I can share with you some information on recent extreme events and their causal link to climate change. The title is Extreme Events of 2021 and Climate Change with a Perspective on Urban Areas. And I would like to start on the warm side of events. Wait a moment, I should first start the presentation mode here.
Yes, please.
So, okay. Well, according to data from the NOAA, from the American Weather Organization, the boreal summer, June through August, or the period June through August 2021, was the second warmest on record in the Northern Hemisphere. And for Europe only, it was the warmest June through August period ever, with temperatures of almost 1 degree centigrade above the 1991 through 2020 average. And here we will look into 4 impactful heat extremes of 2021, indicated by these ellipses here. Then to start with Western North America, end of June, we had extreme heat in British Columbia, southwestern part of Canada, and also western areas of the United States. Almost 50 degrees Celsius in Lytton in British Columbia on 29th of June. Also Portland in Oregon had some 47, almost 47 degrees Celsius, and Seattle and Washington high in the 40s. One of the consequences were wildfires, widespread in this area, and still today it is very active. The wildfire hazard in California and other regions. Urban areas are impacted by heat, by the urban heat island effect, so heat stress. We had several hundreds of excess deaths in southwestern Canada, but also in northwestern parts of the United States, Washington, Oregon, and so on. We had fire hazard, we had wildfire smoke hazard, which exerts a respiratory stress on respiratory systems. So this is the perspective on the urbans affected by this event in June, July. Another important feature of this period was a huge high pressure center residing over Western Russia and even parts of Scandinavia. This was a persistent situation for many weeks, causing also large scale drying up and many wildfires. And the urban areas were impacted in this area by heat stress, also by wildfire smoke. And particularly in August, there was another high pressure area residing over northern Africa and the Mediterranean, causing enormous heat. In Syracuse, Sicily, a new all-time heat record for Europe was registered with almost 49 degrees Celsius on 11th of August. And anomalous high wildfire incidence was observed in the Mediterranean area, so beginning in North Africa, for instance, Algeria, Tunisia, in Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey, and other regions. You see this in the lower right side panel or diagram or map. It's more or less a map on the burned area from wildfires all over Europe. Turkey and Greece had some 4 to 5-fold of normal in terms of the area burned by wildfires. And cities were impacted by heat stress again, the urban heat island effect, in particular enhancing the heat stress in the inner portions of the cities, and fire hazard in the wildlife urban interface around the cities, and also wildfire smoke. And as in the year before, there was anomalous heat, and as a consequence, many wildfires over Siberia, releasing more than 800 megatons of CO2 from burning, which is a substantial contribution to global radiative forcing, to global warming. Urban areas like in Yakutsk, for instance, were impacted by wildfire smoke from this and also by wildfire hazard. So if we are interested in what has caused the European heat waves, we could look onto this map displaying conditions in some 5 to 6 kilometers above ground level. The route of the jet stream as a schematic is represented here by the curved black arrows. And if the jet is on a poleward loop, it organizes high pressure in the lower parts of the atmosphere. That means heat events. And you see the left-hand side poleward loop of this black curved arrow, which was organizing the heat in the Mediterranean. And there's another one to the right-hand side, in the western portions of Russia, which was organizing this high pressure system and heat system already mentioned. There's another feature related to this right-hand side high pressure center. It is a so-called blocking high pressure system because it caused a traffic jam for the low pressure systems arriving from the west. And one of these low pressure systems, which Dirk already mentioned, has caused this destructive flooding in western and central parts of Europe. So everything is connected here. And this is also an impact of climate change. We might cover it later. And yeah, the question, what is predominantly driving up the heat level everywhere is responded to by this slide. It is not only the global mean temperature that is increasing, as we see on this diagram. Physically, this increase in temperature level is driven by ever more radiative energy trapped by the greenhouse gases. And linked to the means, it is also to the global mean of temperature, it is also the daily extreme temperature in the regions that is rising almost everywhere. As an example, we see the increase in hot days exceeding 30 degrees Celsius daily maximum temperature. In Germany here since 1950, where we could also look into other regions where we more or less see the same picture. And such increases mean at the same time that also an ever increasing portion of land area is affected by heat extremes, as shown in the lower right diagram taken from the recently released IPCC report. The blue curve shows this increasing development in percent for severe heat levels, and the orange curve for really extreme heat levels. These are defined in terms of standard deviation units above the mean, which can be locally different. Okay, so that's what is basically behind these heat extremes. And this is also a graph taken from the recently released IPCC report. We see the change in heat extremes per region since the 1950s in a qualitative way. Each hexahedron represents a continental subregion. Yeah? So you see on the left-hand side of these hexahedrons could be roughly seen. So the American, North American and South American continent, and then more to the right hand, you see in the upper part Europe and Asia, and the lower part Africa, and to the very lower side, right hand side, Australia. So this is how it is meant. And what we clearly see here is that almost all subregions are colored in red. This means that heat extremes have increased almost everywhere. And on the right-hand side, you see a projection of how much the heat extremes averaged over global land area, global land surface will increase per global warming level relative to pre-industrial time. So for a 1 in 10 years event, it will increase by 2.75 degree for a global warming level of 2 degrees Celsius. So this is what IPCC has found and is projecting for the future. So it is clear. And at this point, I should mention a study recently published, a scientific study, which found on the basis of more than 700 cases, urban cases or urban spots worldwide, that for the period 1991 through 2018, already a portion of 37% of heat-related deaths can be causally linked to climate change. So this is a quite substantial threat from climate change in terms of urban effects we are already in. Agricultural drought in many regions is closely linked to temperature, as the dryness of air, which causes soils and plants to release moisture and dry up, is a function of temperature. And as indicated by the yellowish colors here, in several regions, agricultural drought has increased, for instance, the Mediterranean, large parts of Africa, East Asia, for instance. And again, on the right-hand side, you see a projection of how much the frequency of agricultural drought averaged over drought-prone global land surface will increase per global warming level relative to pre-industrial times. It is a factor of 2.4 for a global warming level of 2 degrees for a 1 in 10 years event, for instance. I could also spend a few words on wildfire. Just look at the reddish colors in this big map. It shows you the areas where since the late 70s, the frequency of particularly long fire weather seasons have increased, and it has already doubled the area affected by such seasons since the late 1970s. So the same comes true for wildfire in terms of these really substantial increases. But as we did for the warm extremes, we also should look into some wet extremes, just some examples from the June through August period 2021. The bluish greenish colors on this map indicate excess rainfall during this period. And again, we look into some particularly impactful events, starting with Cat 4 hurricane Ida made landfall in southern Louisiana on 29th of August, was one of the strongest storms, or even the strongest storm to hit Louisiana. Severe damage occurred in coastal areas due to storm surge and high winds farther inland, or in particular in the northeastern portion of the United States, New York and other areas there. We had heavy damages due to precipitation, heavy precipitation, flooding, urban flooding, severe convective storm outbreaks, and overall losses will be most likely in the range of several tens of billion US dollars. It's too early to come up with a solid estimation on this. So urban areas were impacted by storm surge, by high winds, by heavy precipitation and flooding. And Dirk already mentioned this almost stationary low pressure system, which caused in mid-July caused a sustained heavy precipitation and flooding in Western Central Europe. Particularly affected were western parts of Germany, for instance, the River Ahr catchment, Belgium, the Netherlands, among other regions of Europe. Severe damages and destruction due to flash flooding, river inundation, landslides in mountainous regions. Insured losses to date amount to some 7 billion euros, but the loss adjustment is still ongoing. Overall losses could also be up to, say, 30 billion euros or so. But it's also still too early to come up with an estimation which is reliable. Urban areas impacted by flash flooding, destructive river flooding, and a last example is taken from Asia, from Eastern Asia. We saw heavy rain and floods in China in July, which was due to typhoons, Infa and Chempaka, and also with really strong impacts in the Henan province, and 100,000 people getting displaced and things like this. It was really a catastrophic flooding also in western parts of Japan in August due to a band-like precipitation system. Again, urban areas impacted by surface and flash flooding, river flooding. These are just a few examples. And well, we are interested in the causal link to climate change here. And we know from science on tropical cyclones such as Ida the following. Extreme precipitation from tropical cyclones is rising with warmer sea surface temperature. This was analyzed thoroughly by science for Hurricane Harvey, but also for other tropical cyclones. We are quite sure that this effect is also true for the Western North Pacific and for all ocean basins where the temperatures are rising. Another thing is that we know that today there is a slower decay in intensity after landfall of a tropical cyclone, be it a hurricane, be it a typhoon, be it a cyclone in the Australian context. And this is due to a higher moisture load, again, due to higher levels of sea surface temperatures. So we know that 24 hours after landfall, today's hurricanes have twice the intensity they had in the 1970s. And this has an impact on the losses they produce. And we have also the observation of slowed down translation speeds today as against former times, which is increasing precipitation. I will skip the other points because here just focusing on the wet side of the tropical cyclones, which was a dramatic feature with Ida and also with the typhoons hitting China already mentioned. For the heavy precipitation event in Europe, the map here shows that we had return periods of this heavy precipitation far above 100 years. And we know from a scientific study, which was done by the World Weather Attribution Initiative, that the heaviest one-day precipitation was a 400-year event in today's climate, but its intensity increased due to climate change by a value from the interval 3 to 12%, and the probability increased by a factor from the interval 1.2 to 9. So the basic message is the magnitude of this event had a likely contribution from climate change. And the last point or last scientific insight pertaining to the already mentioned heavy precipitation events in China. For the Chinese situation, I already mentioned what we found for tropical cyclones. For the heavy precipitation in Western Japan, which was a band-like structure, we know that there's a strong influence from warming sea surface temperatures around Japan on such events. And you see here the diagram for the annual number of station days in excess of 200 millimeters per day is really on the rise. And so we also have the idea that here is a strong link to climate change in the background. Well, after this short overview on causal links to climate change, it's no surprise that IPCC found many continental subregions of the world which have sufficient data quality, where an increase in heavy precipitation was analyzed, indicated by the green color here of the hexahedrons. In the lower right, we learn that for a global warming level of 2 degrees Celsius, one has to expect a 14% increase in heavy precipitation intensity of a 10-year event in the pre-industrial climate. Our last slide summarizes for urban areas both hazard impacts, which we found in recent months, and ways of climate adaptation or disaster risk management to increase resilience. And here I focus already a little bit on the nature-based solutions side. So we several times heard about this urban heat island effect, which can enhance temperatures inside the city by 4 degrees Celsius, or even more, particularly overnight. You see here an example taken from Paris from 2017, where the inner city temperatures were by 4 degrees higher than the surrounding environment. And we will, by the colleagues, hear more about intervention options by green-blue infrastructure, for instance, where we get more evaporative cooling, more ventilation by open spaces, and by a changed albedo, also less absorption of energy into the cities, thereby cooling them. Other impacts, drought, which can really lead to water use restrictions in cities, can be counteracted by catchment scale activities like artificial wetlands, increased agroforest systems, and things like this. And wildfire hazard has a little bit to do also with reducing droughts, but there's a lot of gray actions needed. So keeping distance to the vegetation in the wildlife-urban interface, use fire resistance outer shell materials, but also improve the firefighting capacity, and which is also a nature-based solution thing to improve forest management. The other side, the wet event side, heavy rainfall, flooding. So urban flooding, we saw in Decay, it's sewer systems coming out of capacity, adding to pollution of the city, damage to buildings and infrastructure, public and private transport interrupted, and all these kind of things. Again, here we have solutions coming from green-blue infrastructure, also in combination with some gray things like vegetation spaces or green spaces which have the shape of a dell, which can add to the delay of the runoff, and via interception and evapotranspiration also have at the same time cooling effects for the heat side, also gray things. But this will be dealt with in much more depth, I think, by my colleagues. It's just an outlook or so. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would get back to Himanshu.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Faust. It indeed was a pleasure to hear from you. What was very interesting that you very clearly set out, Dr. Faust, if I may request you to stop sharing your screen, if you like, what was very interesting to see this larger picture. We talk about participation and climate change. If I think from my initial understanding, something that affects all of us, but the scale, the dimension, the speed is quite different for all of us to understand. For many of us in the scientific dimension, we see the changes happening. But if I'm a citizen living in one part of the world, I might not feel it the same way as someone else does. But at the same time, your focus on extreme events and how the frequency is increasing is definitely something we all are becoming quite aware of. And you provided us with a very sound understanding of the larger picture. So thanks a lot for that. With this, I would like to then invite Dr. Zita Savisvari, who is the Vice Director of United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. Zita has also served as the lead author of IPCC Special Report on Ocean and Cryosphere in Changing Climate, and is highly published in the field of ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and ecosystem-based adaptation. So Zita, definitely you would be talking about nature-based solution, the larger angle, but at the same time, some of the key points that Dr. Faust has already flagged. And I know from EHS side, we recently had the interconnected risk report that came out and which you were leading from the very front. So definitely a lot of synergy emerging. And if you would like to already incorporate them in your address now, or we can come to them during the question and answer. So with this, Zita, thanks a lot for your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Himanshu. Do you see my slides in the right format?
Yes,
we do. Thank you. Thank you. So I was tasked to kind of give a bird's eye perspective on nature-based solutions. Where are we right now? What are successes and challenges? And then I would hand over to Dr. Simone Sandholz, who would then specifically focus on the urban perspective and give a bit of a bird's eye view on the urban NBS implementation. And it's probably important to say that this is our first event of a series this week. So what we bring to the table is really this this umbrella perspective. Where are we? And then we will deep dive in the coming days into different aspects of nature-based solutions, right? So to set the stage, I brought two definitions of nature-based solutions, which I think it's worth to look at. So most of the people working on nature-based solutions actually relate to the IUCN definition, meaning actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges. And important that it addresses both human well-being and biodiversity benefits. I would like to highlight that the European Commission is funding a lot of NBS projects. And because of that, you will see in the literature, if you do a literature review, that on NBS, there are a lot of papers which have been published in the European context. And it's probably important to recognize that the European Commission definition is a bit broader. So it's also includes so-called solutions inspired by nature or continuously supported by nature. This means that in some cases, it's just set broader and brings also other considerations to the table than the IUCN definition would kind of consider for. So just a kind of being aware of those differences. So going on with the IUCN definition, it's clearly an umbrella concept which also encompasses all these associated approaches like ecological restoration, engineering, green infrastructure, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem-based mitigation, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. And this is really important to consider because whenever you are doing literature research and you would only focus on NBS, you miss out on very significant progresses and results encountered in other sub areas of nature-based solutions, so to say. So like if we are working together with UNDRR in the context of disaster risk reduction, the language would be ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction or nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. or also in many documents of UNFCCC, you would see ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions for adaptation and mitigation and the like. So just raising awareness for this multitude of approaches and consequently the need to look into different kinds of literature when you are looking for NBS progress. So as the definition mentions, NBS addresses a wide range of societal challenges: climate change mitigation and adaptation, disaster risk reduction, development, human health, food and water security, but also holding environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. We at UNUHS mainly focused so far on EBA and EcoDR considerations. So there's a wealth of experience in that field, but then also taking up more broad NBS projects and also mitigation objectives in some of our projects. One example is the Words into Action. We work together with UNDR, which, as I mentioned, so it's working with the terminology nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction. So NBS, I would say it's a real success story. So far, so there's a growing evidence on the effectiveness of nature-based solutions. If you search the scientific literature, you will find an increasing number of studies which also quantifying the effect of nature-based solutions. Many times the challenge is that the studies need to be very local, and since ecosystems are very context and local context specific, so even if you made a statement for the effectiveness of mangrove forests in a certain context, sometimes it's really difficult to transfer this knowledge to another slide, because you might have a different shape of the coast, different species of mangroves or a very different bathymetry you need to account for. So there are different things you need to consider, but overall there's a much stronger scientific evidence for the effectiveness. NBS and associated approaches have been highlighted in all recent global assessment reports. So all the IPCC reports which have been published between the 5th and the 6th assessment report in the IPBES assessment. So they find their place in these assessments and are highlighted together with their limitations. There is also a voluntary guideline for the Convention on Biodiversity, which also highlights the need to pay more attention to biodiversity considerations. And there's a global standard for NBS, which was developed by IUCN, but with a great consultation effort from various stakeholders. In terms of uptake by member states, Seddon et al. Did a review of nationally determined contributions and found that around 66% of member states actually highlight NBS in their NDCs. And finally, to mention, there's also a strong commitment to NBS projects by the European Commission. And as I mentioned, this influences somewhat the geographical spread of evidence you can find in the scientific literature, and also the type of ecosystems studied. So to raise some of the challenges, the first one I would like to mention that there is a limit of NBS applications also in context of climate change. So if you go, for example, to the summary for policymakers from the IPCC ESROC report, the special report for the ocean and the cryosphere, you will see that for some of the ecosystem-based solutions, such as for coral reef-based coastal protection, The report highlights that at a global warming rate of 1.5 degree, those services are already compromised, and at 2 degree, they would be largely lost. So there is an increasing awareness also that we can't go just for NBS without a strong action on emission reduction. So if we do not stop emissions, many of the NBS solutions will be actually not viable, and that's an important message. Also, what I see as an important gap that currently, we do not really monitor losses and damages to nature-based solutions. So once we implement a solution for adaptation purposes or for disaster risk reduction purposes, we really have to monitor and evaluate their performance with time, and also in the context of climate change, but also other type of impacts which may reduce their effectiveness to actually provide those services they were actually managed for or implemented for. So if there is a forest which meant to contribute to protection against avalanches, for example, then of course I need to manage the forest for that service, and I also need to know if that forest is, for example, suffering from drought or suffering from pests like bark beetles, and with that actually the forest's resilience is decreasing, and the services I'm hoping to receive from the forest are not provided anymore at the extent I would need. I also see that there is a lack of consideration of biodiversity related needs. So although this is very prominent in the definition, so not just human well-being, but also biodiversity, but there are many NBS solutions which are implemented without really accounting for biodiversity, or at least not monitoring for biodiversity outcomes. There's also an overemphasis on tree planting rather than using a wide range of different nature-based solutions. There was a current review which looked into a wide range of NBS implementations, and that was one of the outcomes, that we do look into tree planting, and we tend to forget about other ecosystems and other services. And also sometimes there's an overemphasis of creating something like reforesting or creating nature. I heard these words, we created nature. Instead of looking into protecting healthy ecosystems or providing conditions which allows for a healthy ecosystem to thrive. And finally, I would mention that there is quite an emphasis on cost effectiveness studies. And I wonder, and this might be just my personal opinion, but I wonder how much this cost effectiveness and its primacy actually helping us to reach scale. So if you look at the IUCN global standard, it puts forward 8 criteria. First, that every measure needs to focus on at least one of the societal challenges it's aimed to address. The design needs to consider different scales. Biodiversity gain needs to be one of the important criteria. Economic feasibility, inclusive governance, balancing trade-offs, adaptive management, and mainstreaming and sustainability. Those are the 8 criteria. So I surely do not have time to talk about all of them, but I want to raise some awareness for criterion 4, which is economic viability. And under that, criterion 4.2, which requests that any NBS implementation should have cost effectiveness study ready and provided. So I was wondering if this is actually a good way to reach scale, because cost effectiveness studies for nature-based solutions are quite complex. So either you only consider those services which are you may call the core service, like if you are talking about coral reefs, for example, you could take just the wave reduction potential, and you could then calculate the cost effectiveness of that service. But then you do not include all the co-benefits, which we always argue that it's the strength of the NBS solution. Once you start to include all the co-benefits, like providing habitat for fish, providing natural beauty, recreation, and value, actually the cost effectiveness study gets quite complicated and may need to be turned into a cost benefit study with monetizing everything involved. So in terms of kind of viability in everyday decision making and implementation, it could be quite tedious. So I was wondering if we may think about not to replacing cost effectiveness, but to think also large scale. So what the European Commission is doing nowadays, it's formulated a new program which is called Horizon Europe. And it aims to take a very different approach. So it looks into mission-based funding, and these missions are formulated bold, inspirational goals, which should guide our overall planning, so to say, and not each and every step on the way towards reaching a mission is actually cost effective. So, but it's with this inspiring mission, so to say, you put together a portfolio of actions and changes which helps you to reach your overall goal. So some of the missions which the European Commission reviewed on the way by building up this new research scheme was, for example, the Apollo mission to bring the first man to the moon, or Sweden's Vision Zero policy, that aim to reduce the number of road accidents to zero by 2020. Also, Germany's energy transformation was listed there, but I put there into the list, it wasn't in the European Commission list, the Salmon 2020 program, which aimed to bring back salmon to the Rhine in a sustainable way, in a self-sustained ways. And at the time it was formulated, it seemed to be something unreachable, so to say. So I would like to leave you with this question: what would be the mission for NBS if you would want to think about a mission for NBS? And do we need kind of large aspirational goals next to the small step-by-step and cost-effectiveness led implementation? And with that, I would like to hand over to Simona.
Thanks, Zita. And now let me share my screen so that Zita doesn't need to switch to the next slides. Oh, sorry, again, always the same mistake. Sorry, so it doesn't work. You're still not seeing it in the full presentation.
I do see your screen, Simon, but it's not.
Yeah, sorry. Always struggling with yeah. No, but as Zita said, we're dealing then with the question, how do we then, sorry.
I see your.
Now you're seeing it, right?
Yeah, now I see your presentation. Okay.
Great, sorry for that. As Zita said, we're dealing with the question of what are inspiring missions, not only for NBS, but also for urban nature-based solutions. And then that's, I mean, now let me deal for the next few minutes more with the question of urban areas, which is my core field of expertise, and then how to bring in nature-based solutions there. And we're very thrilled and excited about having such a great group of people now with us to discuss it over the next couple of days, because this really is a topic, and it has been, those nature-based solutions have increasingly been taken up, but we still need to do more. And I'm happy that Eberhard started this presentation with a very thorough overview on climatic change globally and so on. And how does this affect cities? We all know that cities will heat up even more, and that those densely inhabited places are so prone to climate change, but also to disaster impacts. But sometimes you probably still need to visualize it. And I find this, that's a figure from a publication which came out only 2 years ago, and it's showing us how some global cities, how major cities on this globe will change their climates and the climate extremes over the next decades until 2050. And just the color of the dots point us at that the red ones, they'll change until 2050 to extremes which go beyond any kind of climates that we know right now. And the green ones, they'll still change. Like in 2050, the city of London might have the climate that the city of Madrid is facing right now, within a range that we know, but still extreme, because it's a shift. And so we got to do something right now around it. And nature-based approaches can be a very viable solution to deal with it. And that's why, and I know Kuku will deal with all the global agendas even more, but let me just point you at one key document for anyone coming from an urban planning, urban management perspective, which is the new urban agenda. And that does mention nature-based solution in its section on planning and management, planning and managing urban spatial development, by saying integrate disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation into urban and territorial development and planning processes, including nature-based solutions, pointing at the fact that those can help us to deal with those multiple risks. And you heard Zita mentioning co-benefits. So we can implement nature-based solutions and have multiple benefits. They serve for disaster risk reduction, at the same time for adapting to climate change. But at the same time, they also support our well-being by making us feel more comfortable. If we compare a nice park area to some just concrete area. So that's the case is made. So the question is, has it been taken up? And yes, the answer is to some extent. So that's we're also doing quite a lot of research around nature-based solutions, and that's a figure I brought you from a recently published paper where we compared the efficiency of nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, and among others, particularly also for urban areas. And you see in the upper center part, that red dot, which is actually the urban areas. And you see, first of all, that there's a high level of agreement that nature-based solutions can protect urban areas against disaster impacts. And also there was a comparably high level of evidence. And beyond all, we found the highest number of papers on urban areas actually in our very structured systematic review of, I think we were more than 30 authors. And we browsed a couple of hundred papers on urban areas. It was really impressive that case was made very strongly, that nature-based solutions can be a very appropriate tool of protecting urban areas. But then, if you dig a little deeper, we also found one more thing, which is, we look at the bottom left, the largest share of those publications came from North America and Europe, which is areas where certainly the climate would still change, but it's not yet the most extreme areas. So unfortunately, there was a very strong focus on those areas, and also a very strong focus on certain disaster types. If you remember back what Eberhard said around fire events and other extremes like urban heat, those were not the most papers we found. We found most on what you see on the right here, more on stormwater management, flood control, which is still extremely valid. However, it's maybe not yet a full and complete picture. And that's the case we might still need. And then maybe also something that we hopefully will be able to discuss over the course of this week. How can we complement this picture? And I'm coming back to that in a minute. And we also, unfortunately, found a bit of a gap on the economic studies that Zita advocated for, because how do you convince urban decision makers? It's ultimately around the viability and also the comparable economic benefits of implementing those. And here we would need to go back to the rich body, the fortunately already quite rich body of literature and studies, which are, however, mostly around policy and implementation, not yet that much around research. But there is, fortunately, a growing number of studies around the also economic benefits of such nature-based approaches. I'm just bringing you one figure here from maybe one of the front-runner cities, which is New York City, and its green infrastructure plan. See, we're now going back into this interchangeability of terminologies, but it's a couple of years older, but this is one of the front runners which really made the case for other cities to take up those urban nature-based approaches. In this case, for the stormwater management as well. And they did a very complex, comprehensive economic study where you see it's not only around one single measure, it's about the whole plan. And they compared the uptake of green infrastructure against the traditional gray infrastructure, so the sewer system and renewing that and so on. And they really tested the whole scheme of putting together different nature-based solutions like green rooftops, green sidewalks, also having some ponds and some other retention areas. And that paid off comparably, even in the short run. And in the long run, even more, which is also pointing a little bit at the maybe the suitability of certain ways of calculating economic benefits, because certainly all those co-benefits that we advocate for so strongly, including in urban areas, is kind of difficult to include here because it might not be at the very forefront of the line of argumentation. On the other hand, again, this is New York City. So it's another example from, let's say, the Western world. As I told you in the slide before, we had a strong, overall, strong focus on EU and Northern America. And that points at one of the key challenges that I would see in urban nature-based solutions. Cities are not the same. That sounds so obvious, but I still want to make that point. We have different cities of different sizes. They're embedded in different ecosystems, ranging from like a very moderate climate that I'm now sitting here in Bonn to arid to very wet to different climatic zones. And then nature-based approaches might, of course, differ depending on the circumstances. But we also have to deal with a lot of different governance systems. They differ in countries, but also the any nature-based approach we have to see within that given governance system. And also it's a question of scale we need to add here, talking about urban nature-based approaches. How much can be done within the city? Where do we need to enlarge to have for instance, a watershed approach that certainly goes beyond administrative boundaries, maybe beyond country territories and so on. So those are very valid challenges, and then they're not yet being taken up maybe sufficiently to really advocate even stronger for those nature-based solutions. And let me then end on this slide. And that's where I would see the biggest gaps in research and policy that hopefully also we will be able to discuss over the course of the next days and months, speaking about urban nature-based solutions to reduce vulnerability. So there's a strong focus on those studies in the global north and EU and Northern America. And there's therefore a lack of studies still and a lack of evidence and best practices in emerging developing economies, but also if we speak about ecosystems, particularly in arid and semi-arid areas, which might face partly the strongest impacts of climatic change. But there we still need to work more on which nature-based approaches might even be viable there. And drawing back on any kind of best practices and guidance here might be extremely important. The second gap, in all those papers we browsed, we found a super strong trend to really do very small scale research. For instance, researching on which exact species do I need to plant on my green roof, which is very viable and makes a lot of sense. But for an urban decision maker, moving away from the traditional gray infrastructure approach to nature-based solutions, they might need more large-scale, big picture thinking. For instance, saying we can reduce the flood risk in the city if we go beyond the city boundaries and create some retention areas, and you do it this and that way. So thinking beyond, thinking on larger scales would make a lot of sense here. And there, and that's this inspiring mission that Zita talked about. I think we need that. We need to think out of the box here. Also, in the third aspect I want to mention here, including traditional approaches, not only thinking that that very modern, high-end technical approaches are the only go-to solutions. We can also go back to very traditional architectural planning, urban planning, ventilation, shading, and whatever approaches, which are super low-tech, but have been functioning for centuries. And only because of that, they're not outdated. They can still be very go-to solutions that we might even draw back and then go back to when thinking about future climatic change and the climate zones which might change. We might shed an eye on urban plans, urban layouts in other climate zones that we will face in the future then. And yeah, with that, I would end with a figure which is also showing you nice co-benefits of urban nature-based solutions, which is actually the city of Bonn, Zita, and I am located in springtime. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Simon, and thanks a lot for the wonderful picture. It just happens to be the street where I live. And it's definitely, whenever you are in Bonn next time, please try to visit it during the spring. So with this, we now come to Coco. Coco, first and foremost, sorry for keeping you waiting for more than almost 70 minutes now. But now we have seen the larger picture. We have looked at extreme events. We have looked at different types of interventions. We have looked specifically also at NBS, its challenges. And I was very excited when Zita mentioned a moon site, foresight thinking, something you would be discussing also on Wednesday on the futurist thinking workshop. So keeping all these things in the back, how do you see this in the context of larger climate change policy making? What are the contemporary changes? At the same time, if I can also throw the aspirations for COP in the mix, and then you definitely have NBS. So you obviously have so much on your plate to talk about. The floor is yours. Please go ahead. And before I forget, Coco, yes, I'm sorry for not introducing you. So Dr. Coco Warner leads the adaptation, knowledge, and vulnerability teams at UN Climate Change, UNFCCC. She is IPCC lead author on climate impacts. She has founded the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, which is hosted at UNUEHS, and directed research on climate migration at UN University, where she was before. And Coco has been ranked among top 20 women in the climate change debate. So Coco, it's absolute a pleasure to have you all with us all the time. Please go ahead, the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much. And it's wonderful to be with many of you who we haven't met yet, and many longtime friends in this endeavor. Our academy, like Dirk said in his opening remarks, we've been doing this for many years and building a network that accompanies policy as well as practice because it's not just about ideas. The ideas have to land and then grow. And we've seen that in many areas in practice out in the world, Dirk, with all of the work that you and Eberhard are fostering around risk and risk management and transfer and assessment. And of course, in the world of policy and climate policy, we've seen in part through this academy, climate change and human mobility becoming a real theme. We've seen adverse climate impacts getting the spotlight. That's in part under the loss and damage work stream that's now a really big part of the climate negotiations. We've seen resilience and social protection and the role of urban areas. And all of these are, of course, growing in the climate discussion, and not coincidentally because of the work of so many of you. So it's wonderful to be with you. As Himanshu said, I'm working at the UNFCCC and leading work on risk, impacts, and vulnerability, particularly vulnerability. So let's take a quick look at climate policy and what the whole objective is. So I'll take you back to 1992 when the convention was first formulated. And back in the day, if you can imagine, I don't know if all of you were even born then, but back in the day, this was just as there were major geopolitical shifts in international cooperation through the United Nations. Countries successfully created the Montreal Protocol. There was a big transboundary problem with certain chemicals that were eating away at an important layer of the Earth's atmosphere, the ozone. And the Montreal Protocol identified the problem, and through international cooperation was able to create a protocol to find substitutes for those coolants, particularly, I think, CFCs, and foster monitoring and transparency. And since that time, now 30 years, that's been a tremendous success. And that hole in the ozone has, through natural and other processes, gotten better. Well, around that time, there was an Earth Summit in Rio and a recognition that sustainable development and environmental, social, economic concerns are inextricably linked. So it's against that background. Also two really important geopolitical things. The Soviet Union was, let's say, transitioning into the many independent countries that it is today, or that area of the world. China looked really different than it does today with its economic development. Also India and other very populous countries. The Brazilian rainforest had a different state. There was much more standing old growth forests 30 years ago. So against that background, the objective of climate change is, here I'll just read, I have it on my screen, but I didn't want to like make you go numb by making you read a slide. So the ultimate objective of this convention, that's the UNFCCC, and any related legal instruments like the Kyoto Protocol, which came some years later, or the Paris Agreement, is to achieve, in accordance with the relevant provisions of the convention, stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And here's the kicker. Here's the real purpose of climate policy: to stabilize those greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Okay, so the whole point of climate policy is to make sure that human-driven, that's the anthropogenic, climate change doesn't interfere with the climate system. And as we're talking about here, why? Because we need our climate and all of the systems interlinked with that to live and to survive. We're in this beautiful, or we have been in this beautiful Holocene geologic era. And it may be already that we're in the Anthropocene. We may already be well into a whole new geologic era. And I think for humans, as well as all of the additional life forms on Earth, a question is going to be, how will we live in a new era with a different temperature and with possibly altered, possibly permanently altered Earth systems? So I think that's where nature comes in. And I'll say more in just a minute. But let me continue. This is Article 2 of the convention. Now, this stabilization of dangerous anthropogenic, of these greenhouse gas concentrations should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. There's ecosystems. To ensure that food production is not threatened, there's land and us, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So right there in the convention, you see some of the very tricky issues for international cooperation, and we're grappling with those yet. And nature plays a critical role. And Zita, as well as Simona, both emphasized the role of nature. And we've seen that in all throughout the IPCC. We know that land and forests and grasslands and oceans can sequester carbon. They can absorb that carbon out of the atmosphere, but nature can't do it all, particularly in part because humans are encroaching further and further into nature, and we're harnessing nature and kind of making it do our will, but not always in a way that allows the other values that nature provides, those ecosystems, to function in the way that they function. So we have to be quite careful. Now, let me go on to the two instruments of the convention. First, the Kyoto Protocol, and then the Paris Agreement. And what I want you to think about here is maybe not so much about nature, but about how countries try and solve this big challenge with those tough parameters. We need to get greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. With industrialization and the agricultural revolution and a whole bunch of other human activities, people have put a lot of these emissions into the atmosphere, and those emissions are mostly related to the burning of or just emitting carbon or greenhouse gases. Methane is another one. There are several greenhouse gas emissions. I'll focus on carbon. So what's the Kyoto Protocol? The Kyoto Protocol, the main idea in the Kyoto Protocol is that the big traditionally emitting countries, so primarily industrialized countries from the 20th century, would take the lead in a legally binding format and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's how the Kyoto Protocol was supposed to work. And so the world was divided up into two annexes. One annex was industrialized countries, about 38 of them at the time, who committed in a legally binding format to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. And so if anyone asks you if the Kyoto Protocol was successful, the resounding answer is yes. International cooperation delivered a success because the signatories were able to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. And the other annex, by the way, were all kind of, developing countries. And they were not legally bound to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. The problem is that the science with the IPCC's assessments showed the greenhouse gas emissions continued to increase in spite of international commitments. Having a few countries making efforts to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions wasn't enough. And a big debate in those years was also about forestry and things like offsets. The idea behind an offset is an entity is allowed to emit as long as they offset somewhere else. And I think the idea was that markets could help incentivize planting of forests or better stewardship. So that's where we were. And that created a motivation for the Paris Agreement. Now, Himanshu, since you just turned on your camera, I'll speed up. What's the main idea behind the Paris Agreement? Well, if the Kyoto Protocol was a small club focused on legally binding commitments, the Paris Agreement is a large club that includes almost all countries based on voluntary contributions. And that's where we are today. Every country has a job to do in kind of sequestering or getting those greenhouse gas emissions out of the atmosphere. There are a number of ways to do it. Nature is one of them, sequestering through grasslands, forest, and other types of nature-based solutions. But there are a bunch of additional things that need to happen in order to make sure, and this is something that both Zita and Eberhard and Simona emphasize, we have to make sure that we steward nature. Once certain thresholds are passed, it's not clear whether those ecosystems or even biomes at a very, very large geographical scale will have the capacity, let alone not just to mitigate or sequester carbon, but also to play their other functions. So that's the Paris Agreement. It's voluntary. Almost all countries are included. The emphasis is to help move towards the convention to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change, to hold the limit of global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, if not 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're headed towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. The IPCC in its just in August, without using too many words, assessed science that suggests the world might cross that threshold in the early part of the next decade. So we've got, a matter of years. We also need to increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts of climate change and foster climate resilience for both humans and nature. And then, of course, all of the finance flows. So the last thing that I will say is, what can you expect at COP26? What should you be watching for? There are 3 things. If you were watching from home or even participating in Glasgow, there are 3 things you need to watch for. Enhanced ambition. You need enhanced ambition in mitigation and adaptation. Listen to what countries are saying this week and next at the UN General Assembly. You want to listen for commitments of countries saying they'll reduce emissions or they'll pull coal-fired power plants out of production or things like that. So that's what you're looking for. You're also looking for enhanced ambition in adaptation. You may hear statements about cities that have plans to become more resilient. Take a close look at those. That's the first big thing to look for. The second is enhanced finance. And we could talk lots about that. The COP26 presidency is really interested in nature-based solutions. So that will be interesting for you all to listen for. And the third is enhanced implementation. The time for action really is now. We need to take the windows of opportunity that we have before we lose certain, or before, let me just stop. I'm going to trip over words, and we're also always so careful with our words, but you want to see enhanced implementation. That would be projects getting implemented, countries cooperating, transboundary agreements on rivers, or managing food supply chains, or I could mention a whole bunch of things. You'd want to see enhanced cooperation in forest stewardship and grassland stewardship and soil restoration. So there's a lot of work ahead. COP26 is the next big milestone on the road, and I hope that we're all going to see each other there or have your participation. Himanshu, maybe that's enough said.
Definitely, Gaga. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for, I would say, conclude on the action side of the agenda. What we would like to see happening. How can we contribute, in a sense, through the policymaking process, through also the knowledge contributions. And definitely, thanks a lot for this entire overview. So that's exactly what we wanted to do today. And how much we enjoy doing it is evident from the fact that now we barely have 5 minutes left. But the great news is that we have a series of events coming. Today was just what we can say the trailer of the entire series. And today we just touched upon the right questions of, the larger scale. As Eberhard presented, we looked at the global and regional scale of nature-based solution, and not just in the urban area. And then Simon, you provided the urban understanding. And Coco, you rightly started from, from Kyoto Protocol coming all the way to Paris Agreement, and then taking us 2 months already down the line. So it would be exciting to keep a tab of what all is happening. This is what we also would be covering in different dimensions of this debate over the next days. So tomorrow we will be looking at some of the case study. For example, a couple of questions we already see coming in on the local dimension of nature-based solution. I always find it interesting that climate change is such a global phenomenon. And how does the local dimension figures? And if I add to the whole thing, the participation point of view. So maybe this is something, Simone, I would come to you first. Also, the first question was on the local nature of nature-based solution and how does it really goes toward addressing something that global. But again, this is something I guess we would also be covering in events that are coming. The effectiveness of nature-based solution. I mean, Zita, you already rightly pointed towards the limitations. That's also something very, very necessary to be mindful of. And in remaining few minutes, I would, so maybe Simone, with you, we start with the first question. If you would like to tackle the question that came very much in the beginning is, how innovative are the nature-based solutions? And do we use more of local knowledge bases? But at the same time, I would like to request, Coco has already provided her wish list for COP26. Thanks for that. Zita, I would come to you, and Eberhard to you as well. And Dirk, if particularly you would like to focus on the wish list from the private sector or the civil society actors. So Simone, maybe we start from your side.
I think it's a yes and no in this answer. So I think over the last years, nature-based solutions, they're increasingly considered. So it's not something super new. I still believe the uptake, particularly in urban areas by urban decision makers, currently is still something new to them because they have been trained differently. So that there's definitely a gap to be overcome. And yes, we need local knowledge here because we have to adapt it to local circumstances. There's not this one go-to solution that is implementable around the globe because of having different cities, different climate zones, but also different living habits, communities, and so on. So it would be great if this week also helps to work a little bit on this local knowledge.
Yeah, perfect. Now, thanks a lot. With this, we quickly go to, now we come to Zita, to you, but at the same time to all our attendees, thanks a lot for your patience. Your questions are just marvelous. We are not in a position to answer all of them today, but then we have a series of events coming. So tomorrow, same time, 1 o'clock, that is the local German time, we would have our first case study cases. And then at 3:30 German time, we would go into the capacity building aspects and so on. Throughout the week, we would try to take your questions, answer them through some pre-planned events as well. So with this, Zita, your wishes for COP26, what you, either from nature-based solution perspective or your involvement in the entire larger dimension, we don't necessarily have to look at NBS only today, and interconnectedness of risk, something that you very proudly just led at UNUHS. So would you like to address something, or maybe one of the questions if you would like to answer right away?
I think maybe I answer one of the questions. There's a question on local solutions for global problems. And I think this speaks also to the COP26, because if you look into IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, they recognize that so biodiversity and ecosystem related issues are many times very local. So they had to produce a lot of local local assessment, and it's need to have a more so to say local context than sometimes climate change has to. But if we are working on ecosystem-based adaptation, for example, we have to reconcile these different scales, and some of the implementation is local, and that contributes addressing or solving to a more global issue, but also vice versa, as I mentioned, that, for example, coral reefs are really at threat by ocean warming, and that means that our action in terms of reducing emissions will have a very strong impact on corals, for example, but also on many other ecosystems. And with that, we may leave us a larger or smaller window of opportunity to actually use nature-based solutions. So there's an interaction across the scales, and if we miss to understand those interactions, then we will actually fail in our endeavor. So it's important to connect the scales.
Definitely. I mean, this definitely is the take-home message. The interactions, they matter. Nothing in itself is a perfect solution, but all these solutions come together, provide us the way forward. And that is exactly we would be looking for in the final concluding event, what sort of way we have. With this, we are almost out of the time. Last few words, then Eberhard, we come to you. What, from your point of view, would be one particular solution or wish list, whatever you want to add? And Dirk, I hope then we can come to you, and Coco, you would have the last word in terms of, you already have provided your wish list, but maybe the concluding remark for the opening session.
So you would like to have me say something on financing, or what is the?
If we, so from your own perspective, what would be one thing, I mean, could be obviously two things that you would like us to do, be in any capacity, be in decision makers' shoes, or as a civil society, or as a private party, one or two things for a particular actor you would like us to do?
Well, I think to start from more or less the idea of public-private partnership. This perhaps might not cover all these kind of, say, nature-based solution as a solution option or so, but I know some very say successful examples. Perhaps unfortunately more from the developed world. So something I got knowledge about is the Hamburg example, where there is a kind of public co-funding of private implementations or so. So this could be a solution. So kind of subsidizing a project. In Amsterdam, there is a public green fund or so, at city scale, with some 50% private co-funding. So to get to bring such solutions into implementation for. So I think these are routes of kind of financing or supporting this kind of stuff which could be successful. I know that there are also some insurance schemes. It's not already developed pretty much, but there are some initial, I would say, some initial schemes which I think of the Mesoamerican reef insurance, for instance, where there is a kind of a parametric insurance for coastal reef and beaches, which per se have a protecting function for, this is Mexico, for instance, for the beaches and for economic activities which make use of the beaches also. So there are some of such initiatives already there, but in particular on the insurance side, using such nature systems as a kind of insurance per se for eco services. This is, I think, more in the initial stages.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for your emphasis also on the accent from the private side. Dirk, any your wish list or any recommendation, something you would like any of the actors to do immediately?
Well, one thing I mentioned in my introduction is, because we're doing certain things, we are cutting parts out of the nature, and that causes things that we don't want. So one example is, there's a lot of pressure on the housing market right now. So we're trying to build everywhere we can, which in some cities just destroys the regular flow of air through the cities, which increases the heating. At the same time, we're talking about nature-based solutions to cool cities down. So whatever we do, we should think of how does that destroy an already existing nature-based solution. Understand that, and also try to repair where we have already done it wrong in some places. So I think it's not only think about we are now here and everything, we start from a white paper. We have already impacted nature to a large extent, and that causes many of what we now try to repair. And I think that is important. Make the linkages that it's based on nature. Nature is the basis, is the fundamental. And if we're cutting that, we're cutting the tree that we sit on. And that may get us in even deeper trouble.
The message you have sent, like your concluding message, I find is amazing. It's very simple, but at the same very central of all the activities we do. So with this, Coco, we come to you for the final word, the last word for the event. And before this, Christian, we also talked about taking or missing some questions. I don't know if we can do that. So if there's anything urgent you would like to flag from your side, if not, we go to Coco for the final words.
Oh, thank you so much. Should I start? I wanted to pick up on something that Dirk just said. So I live in Bonn, and just a quick anecdote. What we're looking for is transformation. And a lot of times people think, transformation means that tomorrow is going to be totally different than today. And you're expecting almost like magic. But we live in a world where it is so tough. We're negotiating all of the time on any number of things. And the example that Dirk just gave, I think is so appropriate, because we all need a place to live. We all want to send our kids to school. If you have kids, we all need food to eat. And there are trade-offs. And up until now in human experience, we typically have kind of ignored nature and just taken our environment for granted, because it's more or less always been the same within certain bandwidths of variability. And Munich Re and Munich Re Foundation are world leaders in telling us where those bandwidths are in terms of risk. So, okay, Bonn. Why did I mention Bonn? The city government has, in the past probably 2 years, made a very simple decision that's transformative. And how? If you live in Bonn, it's almost the same as it was 2 years ago. So what's transformative? Well, first of all, here's the decision. The city decided that for its public spaces, it would mow the grass less often. None of you just fell off your chair in amazement, right? Nobody. Why is that transformative? Well, a couple of years ago, IPBES, which is like the IPCC, but for biodiversity, made a really big deal. It got picked up in the press about pollinators. And there was a role for science there. It was clear that a lot of things that people are doing with their land in agriculture and other areas are really bad for pollinators. And if we want to eat, we need pollinators. And so cities were asking themselves, wow, what can we do to provide a place, a habitat for pollinators? And many cities, including Bonn, decided, well, grasses and natural flowers provide exactly that habitat for a variety of pollinators, not just industrialized type honeybees, but all kinds of pollinators. And so the city of Bonn mows the grass less often. So if you're riding your bike, you'll see grass is blooming, and sometimes you might think, depending on your opinion about gardening, you might think, oh, that looks like the lawn needs mow. Or you might think, oh, that's really beautiful. I didn't know that that grass looked so gorgeous when it's, 2 or 3 feet high. Why is that transformative? Because a specific behavior leads to a different result. And it may be a 1% change now, but over time, humans have the capacity to regenerate nature. The old idea was that we use up nature and throw it away, maybe even toss it into the ocean. And that type of relationship with nature has created so many of the problems that humanity faces today. If we could reorient towards nature, and certainly in the international climate negotiations, we're trying to do that, or it's one possibility of the way forward. If we could reorient and become regenerative and be stewards of nature, there is great potential ahead of us. The world population is growing. We have lots of opportunity as well as challenges today and in the way ahead. But those 1% shifts, a specific action, be it local or regional or international, they do need to be aligned. We need smart people like you to help us get that alignment, but we know what to do. The next thing are specific actions and aligning together. And, essentially it's like what Dirk and Eberhard and Zita and Simona said, and you probably too, Himanshu, when we can reorient and be stewards of nature, there's just tremendous potential there, not only to solve the problems that we have today, but to open up completely new possibilities for all of us.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Kirko. I mean, We not only need to do different things, we also need to do the same things differently. So this message definitely drives the message for this week home. Please join us tomorrow, same time, German time, 1 o'clock. I would like to thank with this all our speakers, all our panelists, and more than anything, all our attendees for joining today. It was an excellent start to the week where we have just touched upon the questions, I would say. From tomorrow, we start with the case studies with particular solutions, and we very much look forward to your support. So thanks again for joining us today. Have a very nice remainder of the day, a very nice evening, and maybe good morning to some of you. Thank you and see you tomorrow. And the core group, we meet in 15 minutes again. Thank you, bye-bye.